Recently, I've been doing a lot of videos on DC and stuff, with my DC Retrospective series coming to an end, and some Star Wars stuff too. But to prove I have other interests beyond those franchises, I wanted to do a retrospective on something a little different. Somehow, I landed on the miniseries that came out accompanying the toy line GoBots, this being Challenge of the GoBots. GoBots originated as part of a toy line for the Japanese series Machine Robo, and was a line of transforming robot toys, a thing that was sort of a trend in the 1980s with the obviously massive competing toy line Transformers, which itself was an Americanized remake of the toy line Diaclone, which would be the basis for Transformers characters developed by Hasbro, who would hire Marvel to add personality to these designs. Anyways, GoBots similarly came to America around the same time with Tonka. Tonka, the producer of GoBots, similarly hoping to make GoBots a multimedia franchise. Tonka hired Hanna-Barbera to put out the cartoon and create personalities for the characters, and the series ended up having 2 seasons and a 65-episode overall run, with this pilot miniseries we'll be examining today. Tonka would eventually be sold to Hasbro, who would fold it into Transformers' multiverse, though, aside from an IDW comic a few years ago, the GoBots have more or less remained untouched since the 80s. The initial toy line that was released concurrently with the series comprised of 29 standard-sized GoBots, 6 Super GoBots, which were a bit bigger, a mobile fortress, and the evil Zod monster. GoBots, the toy line, was definitely like the great value version of Transformers. I inherited a few of these from my grandma, who dug them out of a closet, and compared to their Transformer counterparts from the era, didn't stand the test of time very well. I had Spacey, Turbo, Leader 1, and her friend. They just weren't as cool as Transformers, but they were ostensibly interchangeable and more or less could be used by kids as an extension of that toy line if they so desired. The story of GoBots is strikingly similar to the story of Transformers. The planet of Gobotron is at war, with the population of GoBots dividing into 2 factions, the Guardians and the Renegades, with the Guardians basically being the Autobots, and the Renegades basically being the Decepticons. With the leaders, Leader 1, a fighter jet, leading the Guardians, and the opposing leader, Psykill, leading the Renegades. Psykill is losing the war, but made contact with a potential ally on Earth, where they can set up shop and regroup until they're ready to bring a second assault on their home planet of Gobotron. Leader 1 follows with some of his homies, and they blast into Earth's orbit, where they meet a group of NASA scientists they quickly team up with, led by a mustached Han Solo clone, Matt Hunter, with their operations supervisor, Dr. Braxis, being Psykill's Earth contact. This information isn't secret very long though. As the group land on Earth, Scooter accompanies Nick, one of the scientists, to the NASA lab, where he sees Psykill and the Renegades rubbing elbows with Dr. Braxis. From here, the Guardians and the Renegades fight with very few twists and turns to the story. The conflict pretty much evolves into rivaling factions fighting over Sorium, which is just Energon basically. It's a super energy source the Renegades want to use to help their conquest of Earth. Eventually, the Renegades get some which allows them to power Dr. Braxis' pulsar generator, which can mind control people. After one last conflict between the Guardians and the Renegades, Psykill is beaten and blasts the pulsar generator, which threatens to send a devastating explosion off, but they manage to teleport it to space, and it obliterates an army of giant Zod robots. I will find him! Which are these big-ass robot dudes, and sends Psykill off into space. Shit was wild. So that was the end of the 5-part miniseries, though much like Transformers' shorter 3-part miniseries, this was just the start, and much like Transformers had several episodes subsequently released, in GoBot's case being 60 more episodes. I don't think anyone will sit here and say Transformers characters were that deep in the early days of G1 before expanded media and tons of episodes expanded them a bit, so I'll talk about the few GoBots and humans that had any sort of relevance to the plot. Of the Guardians, there are a couple notable characters. Leader 1 is the leader of the Guardians, believe it or not. They evidently didn't get massively creative with a lot of the names here. But he's a noble leader who's loyal to his people and believes in defending the humans as well as the people of Gobotron. In other words, he's Optimus Prime but a jet instead of a semi-truck. I will say, from a design standpoint, some of the GoBots are mad creepy, but the series did pretty well to make Leader 1 not entirely uncanny, and when he changes into a jet plane mode, he's just a jet plane. Not a horrible design overall. Not a deep character, but he works. I'm not looking for much depth watching an 80s toy commercial TV show. Scooter is the comic relief of the show and transforms into a scooter that has his ugly mug pasted on the front. That is the thing with the GoBots. Unlike Transformers, many of them just have their faces on the front of their transformation.
They could be anywhere. You worry too much.
These guys are not pressed to be robots in disguise, the same way that the Transformers were. Scooter is the human buddy character more or less, and he kind of just screams and hollers. He isn't super proactive, but you do hear his piercing voice dump exposition on you, which is nice, I guess. The bottom line is the character is ugly, annoying, and sucks.
Oh no! Ah!
Turbo isn't that deep either, but he isn't as awful as Scooter, that's for sure. At least he transforms into a race car, which is refreshing and kind of Leader 1's right-hand man. I actually don't hate this design, so he's not terrible, just kind of generic. Some of the other Guardians that kind of hang around in the miniseries include Hans Cuff, who's a police car. Awful name, just awful design also. He looks like ass. Prowlin' G1, who is the Autobots cop car, was looking cool as hell, so this guy's pretty weak in comparison. Dozer is a bulldozer, which I mean, here in America, us blue-collar hicks know Tonka as the company that makes surprisingly functional kids' trucks, so you gotta have a dozer on the roster. His design is a little cheap, but meh, it's fine. I'll pass him. Rescue is the Ratchet equivalent and is an ambulance. I like him. He gets a pass. Zemon has a cool-ass car. His robot design is lazy as fuck, so I'm gonna give him a failing grade. Spacey is not very practical as a lunar shuttle, honestly. Probably going to cause lots of pollution and be kind of a pain in the ass to get around practically on Earth. His robot form looks like he's in a robo-hate group, so I'm going to fail him for that. Pathfinder has a pretty sweet robot mode. No idea what his vehicle mode is supposed to be though, so he fails. Blaster is a tank thing with 2 missiles strapped to the top. His robot form is meh, but I like the idea that he has 2 massive missiles, so he's pretty cool. I approve. The Renegades actually fared much worse from a design perspective than the Guardians. Psykill is the leader of the Renegades, who's basically just Megatron with a massively shitty design.
Suddenly, Psykill makes an astounding conversion.
Now granted, Megatron didn't have the best design, but at least he had something. Psykill is basically just a motorcycle, again with his face on the front. And he wants to take over Earth so he can set up a new base before he attempts to take over Gobotron. Weak villain, awful design, I don't like him. Copter is a helicopter that's kind of the Renegade's version of Turbo. He again has an awful design when transformed, but looks moderately okay in robot form. Crasher is the femme fatale of the GoBots. She looks okay in vehicle form, turning into a race car, but she's sort of over-designed in robot mode, to say the least. I will say, having some kind of female in the GoBots is kind of refreshing, considering Transformers kind of failed to add any till a bit into their G1 run, but comparing her to RC, it's clear Transformers did it better, though GoBots is probably more feasible looking in terms of making it into a toy. RC's design isn't exactly sensible for making into a car without cheating a little bit and having removable parts and stuff. Zod is a giant tricycle thing. I don't know, he looks stupid, but he's the Renegade's muscle. Tank is a Renegade. You would think would turn into a tank, but it's just kind of a thing. I don't know what the fuck this is. His robot mode's a bit generic, but looks fine, and his vehicle mode sucks. Fitor is kind of a weird looking jet, but he works well enough in robot form. Buggy Man is a dune buggy that looks a bit generic in robot form. Jeeper Creeper is a Jeep. He looks generic and for some reason ended up with a tire on his head. Definitely not as good as Hound from Transformers. Loco is an ugly looking train guy. The train is fine. The robot mode would be fine if the color palette didn't make him look so odd when put to animation. So that was the GoBots, sorry. There are a handful of human characters that are along for the ride. Dr. Braxis is a very Hanna-Barbera looking human character who's basically just an exaggerated mad scientist that affiliates himself with Cykill. He invents stuff. Matt Hunter also looks very Hanna-Barbera. All the human characters do, I'm not going to say that every time. And basically is a really flat Han Solo-like character hiding his somewhat similar appearance behind a mustache. AJ Foster is one of the two NASA intern things. She works with Nick Burns, and they're basically the audience's POV, a la Spike Witwicky from the Transformers cartoon. I remember GoBots looking like shit when I experimented with a few episodes back in the early 2000s, but on this remastered DVD it actually looks pretty solid, or at least better than the VHS rip I was watching put on old 2007 YouTube in like 5 parts that were in 180p quality. I will note that this is also how I originally saw Transformers, and I thought that show looked alright. So it remains to be seen, if I continue on and do subsequent seasons of the show proper, if it'll still look good throughout the entire run. I don't think I watched the miniseries back in the day. The miniseries actually has decent animation, much less clunky than a lot of Hanna-Barbera cartoons I've seen. Granted, a lot of what I saw was the 60s and 70s stuff, so that could be a factor. Tonka may have also put a bit of money around this to establish a popular franchise that would beat out the rival Transforming Robot series that Hasbro was developing around this time as well. Tonally, this show feels slightly more goofy than Transformers G1, with more cartoony human leads.
It's best you forget that you ever saw us. Forget? Are you nuts? Hey, wait a minute. We must not panic your people.
Transformers was also a cartoon advertisement for kids, but this wanted to interject some of Hanna-Barbera's trademark personality characters to add some flair. But the show is probably a slightly dumbed down, less lore-heavy version of Transformers. Not to say Transformers, especially G1, is the deepest thing in the world, it's just a bit more fleshed out. Transformers also made the smart move of taking the toys and attempting to make a lot more out of the little they had to work with for these plastic little toys. Look at Ironhide. What GoBots did was ostensibly transfer the toys right to the screen. Issue is, that makes many of these designs pretty subpar since they were based off of cheap toys meant to sell at the toy store or the drugstore or whatever. Transformers succeeded because they knew making character lore was more important, because the cartoon was really only intended to set up scenarios for kids to follow, not to accurately translate the toys 100% from the toy line. Kids can use their imagination to fill in the rest, and I think that was a smart move on Transformers' parts over GoBots, because it ends up looking a little stilted in this show sometimes. The theme song for GoBots is kind of a bop. Not as good as Transformers' theme song, which is a banger.
Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons.
But kind of a bop for sure. The composers of 80s kid theme songs were on a roll. They weren't missing. In-episode music is pretty plain, but honestly that shit doesn't really matter. It's 100% down to that 30-second jingle at the start. That's how cartoons get into people's brains after all. Overall, GoBots is a kid's cartoon from the 80s. It's surprisingly not horrible at following that criteria, but it's just that. I think the problem with the show is the character designs couldn't hold a finger to Transformers. And even with the arguably better human characters and similar plot, I feel Transformers still succeeds in putting the character designs for the show above being toy accurate, because as I laid out, that stuff doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Well, GoBots ended up with a fairly solid 65 total episodes with a feature film, which isn't horrible when going up against Transformers' 98 episodes in a film. Granted, their film was about transforming rocks, but we'll come back to that perhaps. The toy line lasted until 1986, with the toy line releasing for the Rock Lords film as well. Machine Robo is around, occasionally having a toy or two release, and having some animated projects throughout the years, though the Robotron franchise is owned by Bandai these days. With Eagle Robo, the basis for Leader 1, having a toy as recent as 2016 in Japan. That toy line looks fairly in line with modern Transformers toys, so it might be worth a pickup for people nostalgic for these shows. GoBots proper had a 2018 IDW miniseries, IDW being the current home of Transformers comics, so it's sort of in line with those. Hasbro, as I stated earlier, owns the rights to GoBots these days and doesn't do much with them, in favor of working on Transformers, the name brand equivalent of GoBots. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, perhaps I'll watch the other seasons on the Rock Lords at some point, but it'll probably be a bit. This is just an oddity from my childhood I decided to dig back up because I was curious.